The morning of March 9th, 1945, somewhere in the volcanic ridges north of Iwo Jima's airfield, a Japanese engineer named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada crouched inside a bunker that smelled of sulfur and death. Outside, the Americans were advancing again. Artillery shells hammered the rock, machine gun fire rattled like hail on steel. But Yamada was not watching the battle. He was staring at a weapon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It lay on a wooden crate before him, blackened and twisted from fire. An American flamethrower, captured 3 days earlier from the body of a Marine who had come too close to a spider hole. Yamada had been ordered to examine it, to understand it, to find its weakness. For weeks, reports had filtered through the tunnels, whispered from cave to cave. The Americans had brought a new terror to the island. Not bombs, not shells. Fire, liquid fire that poured into bunkers and turned men into ash. Yamada measured the tanks. 4.5 gallons of fuel, nitrogen propellant, a wand with 2 triggers, one for fuel, one for ignition. He unscrewed the nozzle, noting the phosphorus igniter cartridges designed to burn for seconds at a time. The weapon was elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its purpose. He wrote in his notebook, his handwriting precise despite the trembling of the earth above him. Range: approximately 70 yards when using thickened fuel. Duration: 7 to 8 seconds continuous fire. Weakness: operator must approach within lethal distance. Fuel tanks vulnerable to puncture. He paused, then added a final line. Psychological effect: absolute. Yamada did not know it then, but he was documenting the weapon that would define the endgame of the Pacific War. A weapon so effective that it would force an empire to reconsider its most sacred beliefs. A weapon that turned fortresses into ovens and warriors into men who chose surrender over burning alive. This is the story of how a simple backpack flamethrower shattered the myth of the impregnable Japanese defense, and how, in examining their enemy's fire, Japanese soldiers discovered a truth more terrifying than any flame: that courage, no matter how absolute, could not withstand innovation. To understand why Yamada sat in that bunker studying a weapon he had been trained to despise, we must step back to the winter of 1944. By then, Japan's defensive strategy in the Pacific had reached its final, desperate evolution. The Americans were no longer distant invaders. They were a relentless tide, island hopping closer to the home islands with every passing month. Saipan had fallen in July, the Marianas were lost, and from those captured airfields, massive B-29 bombers could now strike Tokyo itself. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood the calculus of defeat better than most. When he arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, he carried no illusions of victory. He had studied in Canada before the war. He had seen American factories, their assembly lines churning out tanks and aircraft at a pace Japan could never match. His orders were not to win, but to make the Americans pay. Every day of delay. Every gallon of blood spilled on the volcanic ash would bring the war one step closer to negotiation. Kuribayashi broke with centuries of samurai tradition. No banzai charges, no suicidal mass attacks on the beaches. Instead, he would turn Iwo Jima itself into a weapon. His engineers carved 11 miles of tunnels through the volcanic rock, with plans for 17. Some chambers descended 7 stories deep, 5,000 caves and dugouts connected by hidden passageways, underground hospitals with operating theaters, storage rooms stocked with rice and water for months, communication centers buried 75 feet down, linked by telephone wire. Above ground, 1,500 concrete positions dotted the island, each one carefully placed to provide interlocking fields of fire. Pillboxes reinforced with 4 feet of concrete, bunkers hidden behind steel shutters that opened only long enough to spit fire, then closed before American guns could answer. From Mount Suribachi in the south to the northern plateau, every inch of the island was sighted, mapped, calculated. 21,000 men would defend this fortress. Every soldier, Kuribayashi told his officers, must kill 10 Americans before he dies. For 74 days before the landings, American battleships and bombers pounded the island. Nearly 7,000 tons of explosives, 22,000 naval shells. The beaches were churned into smoke and rubble. Planners believed the bombardment had wiped out most resistance. They projected the island would fall in 5 days. They were catastrophically wrong. When the Marines came ashore on February 19th, 1945, they met an enemy untouched. Less than 200 Japanese positions had been destroyed. The rest remained intact, artillery and machine guns hidden in the volcanic ridges, erupting with deadly precision. But the Americans brought something Kuribayashi had not fully anticipated. In the holds of their transport ships, alongside the usual arsenal of rifles and artillery, came a weapon that defied the logic of fortification. The M2 flamethrower. To the Marines who carried it, the weapon was a last resort, a tool for impossible situations. To the Japanese defenders waiting underground, it would become the one thing their concrete and steel could not stop. The M2 was born from desperation and failure. In 1942, the first American flamethrowers had been disasters. The Mon used a hydrogen ignition system that failed in the humidity of the Pacific. Its range was barely 15 yards. Its fuel, a simple gasoline mixture, burned so quickly that it was mostly consumed before reaching the target. Marines called it unreliable, cumbersome, a weapon that made you a target without giving you a chance to survive. But the Chemical Warfare Service learned. They studied captured German designs from North Africa. They examined British systems. And, quietly, they analyzed Japanese flamethrowers seized on Guadalcanal. The enemy's Model 100 had features worth copying. A more efficient valve system, better fuel flow, simpler mechanics. American engineers took the best of each design and built something new. The M2, introduced in the summer of 1944, was a revolution. It weighed 68 pounds when filled with 4.5 gallons of fuel. Nitrogen, not hydrogen, pressurized the system, making it safer and more reliable. The ignition used phosphorus cartridges, not batteries, so it worked in rain and mud, but the true breakthrough was the fuel itself. Napalm, a thickening agent made from naphthenic and palmitic acids, invented by Harvard chemist Louis Fieser on Valentine's Day, 1942. Napalm changed everything. Where gasoline exploded into a massive bloom and vanished, napalm left the flamethrower as a tight, dark-colored jet stream. It clung to surfaces. It seeped into cracks. It burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With napalm, the M2 could reach 40 yards, double the range of the older models. A Marine could stand outside a pillbox, aim the wand through a firing slit, and pour liquid fire inside. The flame would ricochet off walls, filling every corner, consuming oxygen, turning the bunker into a furnace. Marines trained relentlessly with the weapon. They learned to fire in short bursts, 2 to 3 seconds, conserving fuel. They practiced skip shooting, bouncing streams off cave mouths to hit defenders hiding around corners. They developed assault tactics. Riflemen and BAR gunners would suppress the target with covering fire. Then the flamethrower operator would advance, crouched low, and unleash hell. Demolition teams followed behind, sealing the position with explosives. But the weapon came with a terrible cost. Flamethrower operators had a life expectancy measured in minutes. They were the most visible targets on the battlefield. The hiss of nitrogen, the roar of ignition, the jet of flame, all of it screamed, "Shoot me first." Japanese snipers targeted them relentlessly. A single bullet could rupture the fuel tanks, sending the operator flying backward in a cloud of nitrogen. An incendiary round could ignite the fuel, turning the Marine into a human torch. By the time Iwo Jima was invaded, casualty rates among flamethrower operators sometimes exceeded 90%. Entire units were wiped out in days. Yet volunteers kept stepping forward, because they understood what the generals understood. Without the flamethrower, the caves of Iwo Jima could not be taken. Not without losses that would make the battle unwinnable. When the first M2 operators went into action on Iwo Jima, the effect was immediate and total. On February 21st, the second day of the battle, the 21st Marine Regiment was pinned at Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 pillboxes dominated the field, their interlocking fire cutting down anyone who tried to cross. 2 rifle companies had already been shredded in frontal assaults. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis made the call. He ordered the flamethrower teams forward. Staff Sergeant Robert Mazer and his crew advanced through volcanic ash that pulled at their boots like quicksand. To Japanese defenders watching from firing slits, the Marine looked like any other infantryman, until the hiss sounded. A jet of flame erupted, thick and dark, roaring across 125 yards before slamming into the concrete. The flame poured inside, crawling through the machine gun port, filling the bunker like molten lava. Inside, oxygen vanished in seconds. Men suffocated before the fire touched them. Those who staggered to the rear exits were cut down by Marines waiting in the smoke. The tank traversed, fired again. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun slammed into the Sherman at point-blank range, ricocheted skyward. The tank kept moving. Another burst of flame, another bunker consumed. In minutes, positions that had defied 2 days of assault were gone. Marines surged forward, advancing 400 yards, more progress than in the previous 48 hours. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. The flame tanks work, but it was the portable flamethrowers, carried by individual Marines, that truly broke the Japanese will. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, 5 feet 6 inches tall, carried 70 pounds of fuel and fire on his back. On February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, he volunteered to assault a network of pillboxes that had stalled an entire battalion. For 4 hours, he advanced alone, covered by 4 riflemen. He approached, to within 15 yards of each position, close enough to see the gun barrels, close enough to hear the enemy shouting inside. He squeezed the trigger. Flame poured through apertures, through air vents, through any opening he could find. On one occasion, he climbed onto the roof of a pillbox and inserted the nozzle through a pipe, killing everyone inside. When Japanese soldiers charged him with fixed bayonets, he held his ground, firing at 15 yards, incinerating them before they could reach him. Williams went through 6 flamethrowers that afternoon. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. But he never forgot the screams. Inside the Japanese tunnels, panic spread faster than fire. Soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the last man began abandoning positions. Commanders issued frantic orders, but the terror was too deep. Reports reached General Kuribayashi's headquarters, buried 75 feet underground. The enemy's flame weapons are more effective than their artillery or bombardment. We have no counter. They turn our strongest positions into our tombs. Lieutenant Yamada, the engineer studying the captured flamethrower, understood the problem with brutal clarity. The weapon exploited the one weakness Japanese defenses could not overcome, the need for air. Bunkers required ventilation, caves needed exits, tunnels had to breathe, and every opening, no matter how small, was an invitation for fire. Napalm did not care about concrete thickness or steel reinforcement. It flowed like water, found every crack, and turned shelters into crematoriums. Yamada wrote recommendations: seal all ventilation shafts, create multiple exits to avoid being trapped, install fireproof doors. But the recommendations were impossible to implement. The tunnels had been carved over months. Changing them now, under constant bombardment, was futile. And even if they could be modified, the psychological damage was done. Men who had trained their entire lives to face bullets and bayonets discovered that fire was different. Fire was absolute. Japanese interrogation reports captured after the battle revealed a chilling pattern. When asked why they surrendered an act once considered unthinkable, prisoners gave the same answer again and again. Fear of burning alive. Not bullets, not shells, not starvation. Fire. The Americans had weaponized the oldest human terror, and it worked. On March 11th, 3 weeks into the battle, a breakthrough moment occurred at the base of Mount Suribachi. Tank 432, one of the modified Sherman flamethrower tanks, stopped before a network of caves. The gunner did not fire at the entrances. Instead, he fired into the open air above them. A short burst, a warning. The effect was immediate. Japanese soldiers poured out, fleeing through rear exits. For the first time in memory, Imperial troops abandoned positions rather than die in them. Marines watched in astonishment as defenders surrendered their fortress without a fight. The tactic spread. Flamethrower operators began using demonstration shots, firing into the air near cave mouths. The message was clear: come out or burn. In sector after sector, Japanese soldiers chose life over honor. The myth of the samurai, the warrior who would never surrender, dissolved in the face of liquid fire. Officers who had preached the spirit of Bushido for years found their words meaningless when napalm poured through the darkness. By the end of March, Iwo Jima was declared secure. 36 days of slaughter had cost America 26,000 casualties, with nearly 7,000 dead. Japan had lost nearly all of its 21,000 defenders. Of those, only 216 emerged as prisoners. Many cited a single reason for surrendering: fear of burning alive. The flamethrower had not just broken bunkers, it had broken the will to fight. Lieutenant Yamada did not survive the battle. His body was found in a collapsed tunnel on March 24th, a notebook clutched in his hand. The final entry, written in shaking characters, read, "The fire weapon cannot be stopped by courage. It cannot be stopped by steel. We have lost not because our spirit failed, but because we believed spirit was enough." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Americans who operated the flamethrowers carried their own scars. Corporal Thomas Carlson, gunner on Tank 431, spoke years later of the nights after the battle. You'd hear it for only a few seconds, but at night you kept hearing it again, the screaming. You can't ever burn it out of your mind. Maintenance crews who scraped charred remains from tank hulls, who patched holes blackened by explosions, fought to keep the machines alive, while never forgetting what those machines had done. For American commanders, the lesson was undeniable. Flamethrower tanks and portable units had not only saved lives, they had demonstrated the future of warfare. Innovation, technology, and industrial power could overcome even the most determined human resistance. Courage alone was no longer enough. Within months, dozens more flamethrower Shermans were ordered for Okinawa. There, too, they proved decisive, reducing cave systems that conventional weapons could not touch. The doctrine of combined arms evolved. Armor, infantry, and engineers, all working in concert, with flame at the spearhead. For the Marine Corps, the lesson was burned into doctrine. Technology and adaptation were as vital as courage. After the war, the lineage continued. Flamethrower tanks rumbled across Korean hillsides, their jets of fire clearing Chinese bunkers at the Punch Bowl and Heartbreak Ridge. Into the 1960s and 70s, flamethrowers remained in the American arsenal. The M132 armored flamethrower carried the torch, literally, before international law and public conscience finally consigned such weapons to history. By 1978, the last flame tanks were retired. But their psychological legacy endured. At Quantico, Virginia, one surviving Iwo Jima flame tank sits in silent testimony. Visitors see the scars welded into its armor, the dents from shells, the blackened steel. What they cannot see is the terror it inspired, the screams it silenced, the lives it saved. For the Japanese, too, the memory lingered. Former defenders testified that the flame tanks broke their spirit in ways no bullet could. Underground tunnels that once promised safety became tombs of fire. Their courage had not failed. Their tactics had not failed. But their imagination had been surpassed. In the years after 1945, irony completed its cruel circle. The newly formed Japanese self-defense forces listed automatic shotguns and flamethrowers at the top of their close combat requirements. The very weapons once condemned as dishonorable now became essential. American pragmatism had not only crushed Japanese tactics, it had reshaped them. Manuals that once exalted the bayonet now preached the value of firepower, technology, and preservation of life. Honor was no longer measured in death, but in survival. The deepest legacy was not tactical, it was philosophical. The flamethrower revealed that war does not reward tradition or honor. It rewards adaptation. An empire that sent men armed with swords into storms of fire was not noble. It was blind. And a nation that armed young men with simple tools, then taught them to survive, proved that pragmatism could outlast any creed. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from Korea to Vietnam, the fire of innovation whispered the same truth. In the crucible of war, survival is the only true honor. And in the volcanic tunnels of Iwo Jima, the flame of a captured weapon became the light that revealed an empire's final, fatal lesson. Japanese engineers like Lieutenant Yamada examined the M2 flamethrower with meticulous precision. They measured its tanks, studied its valve systems, calculated its range. 70 yards, 45 seconds of continuous fire if needed, though doctrine advised bursts of 2 to 3 seconds. They noted the nitrogen propellant, safer than the hydrogen systems of earlier models. They documented the phosphorus igniter cartridges, 5 per cylinder, each burning just long enough to light the napalm stream. But no amount of technical analysis could solve the fundamental problem. The flamethrower was not just a weapon, it was a negation of everything the Japanese defense relied upon. Fortifications became traps, courage became irrelevant. The samurai code, with its emphasis on facing death with honor, crumbled when death came not from a blade or bullet, but from fire that turned flesh to ash in seconds. Post-war interrogations revealed the psychological devastation. One former captain, interviewed in 1946, described the moment he first encountered an American flamethrower. "We had trained to fear nothing. We were told that our spirit was unbreakable. But when the fire came, when it poured through the gun ports and filled the chamber, I understood that all our training was meaningless. You cannot fight fire with courage. You cannot stop it with a sword. You can only run or burn." The statistics told the brutal story. In sectors where flame tanks operated, American losses dropped by nearly 40%. More than 1,000 fortified positions were destroyed by flame weapons. 30% of Japanese casualties on Iwo Jima were inflicted by fire, either from portable flamethrowers or the armored variants. Analysts estimated that as many as 5,000 marine lives had been spared because of 8 machines and a few hundred portable units. The Japanese response was desperate and futile. Suicide squads with explosives strapped to their bodies. Snipers aiming for the narrow vision slits of Turks' tank crews. Gunners concentrating every available weapon on the Shermans. But it was never enough. The tanks looked identical to regular armor until the moment they fired. By then, the hiss had already sounded, and the flames were already pouring. General Kuribayashi, in one of his final transmissions before being killed in action, admitted the unthinkable. "The enemy's flame tanks have proven more effective than their artillery or their bombardment. We have no counter. They turn our strongest positions into our tombs." It was a confession that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The Imperial Japanese Army, raised on the belief that spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, had met a weapon that rendered spirit meaningless. On March 26, 1945, Iwo Jima was declared secure. But the echoes of flame continued long after the guns fell silent. Veterans on both sides carried the weight. American flamethrower operators spoke of nightmares, of faces, burning, of screams that never stopped. Japanese survivors spoke of a terror that no training had prepared them for, a fear so absolute that it shattered centuries of tradition. In the cold arithmetic of war, the flamethrower was a success. 8 Sherman tanks, modified in secrecy, deployed on a single island, had shifted the mathematics of death. They had shown that innovation mattered more than courage. That technology could break will as effectively as it broke steel. That the future of warfare belonged not to the warriors who believed spirit was enough, but to the engineers who understood that war was a problem to be solved. The flamethrower did not win the Pacific War alone, but it revealed the truth that would define the war's end. That Japan's faith in the samurai code, in the power of will over material, was a beautiful delusion, and that America's faith in pragmatism, in machines and innovation and industrial might, was the harder truth that history would reward. Lieutenant Yamada's notebook, recovered from the ruins of Iwo Jima, sits today in a Japanese military archive. His technical drawings of the M2 flamethrower are precise, his observations accurate, but his final words remain the most haunting testimony to what flame revealed. We believed courage was enough. The fire taught us otherwise. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima did not remain confined to that volcanic island. Within weeks of the battle's end, American military planners were already drafting new doctrines, new tactics, new strategies built around the weapon that had proven so devastating. The flamethrower, once seen as a specialized tool for unique situations, was now recognized as essential to any operation against fortified positions. And nowhere would this lesson be applied more thoroughly than in the next great battle, Okinawa. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, began on April 1, 1945. The island was larger than Iwo Jima, more heavily populated, and defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops. General Mitsuru Ushijima had studied Kuribayashi's tactics. He too would avoid banzai charges. He too would turn the island into a fortress with thousands of caves, tunnels, and bunkers carved into the limestone ridges of the south. But unlike Kuribayashi, Ushijima knew what was coming. He had read the reports from Iwo Jima. He knew about the flame tanks. He knew about the M2 flamethrowers. And he had ordered his engineers to prepare countermeasures. Japanese defenders on Okinawa built thicker concrete walls. They installed multiple exits in every cave system, ensuring that if fire came through one entrance, soldiers could escape through another. They positioned anti-tank guns specifically to target the flame tanks, aiming for the fuel storage compartments. They trained snipers to identify flamethrower operators by their distinctive equipment and eliminate them before they could get within range. On paper, the countermeasures were sound. In practice, they failed. The Americans arrived with more flamethrowers than ever before. Every Marine regiment was now assigned 81 portable M2 units. Flamethrower tank battalions had been expanded. New tactics had been developed. The corkscrew and blowtorch method, pioneered on Iwo Jima, was now standard doctrine. Riflemen and BAR gunners would suppress enemy positions with sustained fire, pinning defenders inside their fortifications. Then the flamethrower operators would advance, pouring fire through any opening they could find. Finally, demolition teams would seal the positions with explosives, ensuring they could never be reoccupied. But Okinawa introduced a new dimension of horror. The island's civilian population, numbering over 300,000, had been told by Japanese propaganda that Americans were monsters who would torture and kill anyone they captured. Thousands of civilians fled into the caves alongside the soldiers. When the flamethrowers came, the caves became mass graves. Families huddled in the darkness, waiting for the fire. Some chose suicide rather than face the flames. Others died when napalm consumed the oxygen, suffocating everyone inside. Marine flamethrower operators faced an impossible moral calculus. How could you tell if a cave held soldiers or civilians? How could you know if the shadows moving in the darkness were enemy combatants or terrified families? The answer, brutal and simple, was that you couldn't. You fired first, or you died. The psychological weight of this reality broke men in ways that bullets never could. Corporal Eugene Sledge, a Marine who fought on Okinawa, described the aftermath of a flamethrower attack in his memoir. We came upon a cave that had been hit with fire. The entrance was blackened, and the smell was overwhelming. Inside, we found what remained. Bodies burned beyond recognition. Some were soldiers, some were not. We didn't talk about it. We just moved on to the next cave, and the next, and the next. By the end, we were numb to it. We had to be, or we'd go insane. Japanese tactics evolved in desperation. Since they could not stop the flamethrowers directly, they tried to prevent them from getting close. Snipers worked in teams, targeting the riflemen who provided covering fire for the flamethrower operators. Anti-tank teams used shaped charges to disable the fuel tanks on the Sherman variants. Suicide bombers, armed with satchel charges, would wait in spider holes and detonate themselves when the flame tanks passed overhead. The casualty rates were staggering on both sides, but the mathematics of attrition favored the Americans. For every flamethrower operator killed, another stepped forward. For every flame tank destroyed, another rolled off the assembly line. Japan had no such reserves. By May of 1945, 2 months into the battle for Okinawa, the tide was irreversible. The southern ridges, once thought impregnable, were being cleared, cave by cave, position by position. Over 200,000 gallons of napalm had been used. The landscape was scorched black. On June 23rd, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide in his command cave as American forces closed in. The battle was over, but the costs were staggering. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including 12,000 dead. Japanese military deaths numbered over 100,000. Civilian deaths were estimated at anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000, many of them in caves that had been hit with flamethrowers. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Yet military analysts noted a critical statistic. Without the flamethrowers, casualties would have been far worse. The caves of Okinawa were more extensive than those on Iwo Jima. Conventional weapons, artillery and naval bombardment had proven almost useless against them. Only fire could reach into the depths, and only fire could force defenders to abandon positions they would otherwise have held to the death. The flamethrower had become, paradoxically, a weapon that saved lives by taking them. But even as the flames consumed Okinawa, the American military was preparing for something far larger. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, was scheduled for November of 1945. Intelligence estimates projected casualties in the millions, both American and Japanese. The home islands would be defended by over 2 million soldiers, plus millions of armed civilians trained in suicide tactics. Every village would be a fortress. Every city would be a killing ground. American planners knew that flamethrowers would be essential. Production was ramped up. Thousands of portable M2 units were manufactured. Dozens of new flame tanks were converted from standard Shermans. Training programs expanded to prepare an entire generation of soldiers for the nightmare of urban cave fighting on Japanese soil. But even as these preparations intensified, the calculus of war was shifting in ways no one anticipated. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Operation Downfall was cancelled. The flamethrowers, stockpiled for an invasion that would never come, sat unused in warehouses across the Pacific. The weapon that had defined the endgame of the island campaigns would never face its ultimate test. Yet the legacy of the flamethrower did not end with Japan's surrender. In Tokyo, as American occupation forces arrived, Japanese military officers were already analyzing what had gone wrong. How had an empire that once dominated the Pacific been brought to its knees? The answers were complex, involving industry, logistics, and strategy. But one weapon kept appearing in the reports, in the testimonies of survivors, in the nightmares of veterans: flamethrower. The Japanese Self-Defense Forces, established in 1954, incorporated lessons learned from the war into their doctrine. Among the first weapons they acquired were flamethrowers, modelled directly on the American M2 design. The irony was profound. A weapon once denounced as dishonourable, as a tool of cowards, was now considered essential. The samurai code, which had once taught that close combat with blade and bayonet was the highest form of warfare, had been replaced by a pragmatic understanding that firepower, not spirit, determined victory. This philosophical shift extended beyond military doctrine. In the ruins of post-war Japan, a new generation grew up hearing stories from fathers and uncles who had fought in the caves. They learned not about glory and honor, but about fear and survival. The mythology of the invincible warrior, the soldier who would never surrender, was quietly abandoned. In its place emerged a different kind of national identity. One, focused on rebuilding, innovation, and economic strength rather than martial prowess. American veterans carried their own burdens. Flamethrower operators, the men who had poured liquid fire into caves and bunkers, returned home to a nation that celebrated their victory but did not understand their trauma. They spoke little of what they had done. When they did speak, It was often in fragments, disconnected images that haunted them decades later, the hiss of nitrogen, the roar of ignition, the screams that followed. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who studied veterans in the 1960s, noted a pattern among former flamethrower operators. They suffered nightmares at rates significantly higher than other combat veterans. They reported feelings of guilt that no amount of therapy could fully resolve. One veteran told Lifton, "I know we had to do it. I know it saved American lives. But that doesn't stop me from seeing their faces. That doesn't stop me from hearing them scream." The weapon itself continued to evolve. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, flamethrowers were used extensively to clear Chinese and North Korean bunkers in the frozen mountains. The M2A12 variant, with improved regulators and safety valves, became the standard issue. Tank-mounted versions cleared trenches and fortified positions with brutal efficiency. But even in Korea, the psychological effect remained the weapon's most powerful aspect. Chinese troops, who had shown remarkable courage under artillery fire, would abandon positions when flame tanks appeared. In Vietnam, the M9A17 became the primary man-portable flamethrower. It was lighter, more reliable, and had better range than the M2. But the nature of the war in Vietnam made flamethrowers less effective than they had been in the Pacific. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army rarely fought from fixed positions. Their tunnels at Cu Chi and other locations were too extensive and complex to be easily cleared with fire. Moreover, the political and moral costs of using flamethrowers against a largely guerrilla enemy became increasingly difficult to justify. By the 1970s, public opinion had turned against flamethrowers. Images of Vietnamese villages burning, of civilians fleeing from American fire attacks, created controversy that military effectiveness could not overcome. In 1978, the United States military officially retired all flamethrower weapons. Protocol 3 of the Geneva Convention, adopted in 1980, prohibited the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. The age of the flamethrower, which had begun in World War I and reached its apex in the Pacific campaigns of World War II, had ended. But the technological lineage continued in other forms. Thermobaric weapons, which use explosions to create overpressure and consume oxygen in enclosed spaces, achieved many of the same effects as flamethrowers without the visual horror of burning victims. Incendiary rockets, like the M202 Flash, provided similar capabilities at longer range. The principle remained the same. When conventional weapons fail against fortified positions, fire succeeds. Today, the M2 flamethrowers used on Iwo Jima and Okinawa reside in museums across America and Japan. They are displayed alongside other artifacts of the Pacific War: rifles, helmets, flags. But unlike those other weapons, the flamethrowers carry a unique weight. Museum visitors pause before them longer. They read the plaques more carefully. They ask more questions. What was it like to use this weapon? What was it like to face it? At the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, a restored M2 sits in a glass case. The placard beside it includes a quote from a Marine veteran. "We didn't want to use it. We had to use it. That's the difference." Nearby, a translated excerpt from a Japanese soldier's diary. "When the fire came, all our training, all our courage, meant nothing. We could only run or die." These two statements, placed side by side, encapsulate the terrible paradox of the flamethrower. It was a weapon that no one wanted to use and no one wanted to face, yet it proved essential to ending the war. It saved American lives by taking Japanese lives in the most horrific way imaginable. It forced an enemy to surrender by making resistance more terrifying than defeat. In the calculus of total war, it worked. But the moral weight of that success still echoes through the decades. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada, the Japanese engineer who examined the captured M2 in a bunker on Iwo Jima, represented thousands of soldiers who tried to understand their enemy's weapons in the hope of countering them. His technical analysis was accurate, his observations were precise, but his final conclusion, written moments before his death, revealed a deeper truth. We believed courage was enough. The fire taught us. Otherwise, This lesson extended far beyond the battlefield. In the post-war world, nations learned that technological superiority could overcome any amount of willpower or determination. The atomic bomb, dropped just months after Iwo Jima and Okinawa, reinforced this lesson with apocalyptic finality. But the flamethrower had taught it first, in caves and tunnels across the Pacific, where liquid fire consumed the last remnants of an empire built on martial tradition. The story of the flamethrower is not a story of glory. It is a story of necessity and horror, of innovation and trauma, of lives saved through methods that haunt those who employed them. It is a reminder that war rewards adaptation, not tradition. That survival, not honor, is the ultimate measure of success. And that the weapons we create to protect ourselves can leave scars as deep as any enemy infliction. In the volcanic caves of Iwo Jima, where Marines poured napalm into darkness and Japanese soldiers chose between fire and surrender, a fundamental transformation occurred. The samurai code, which had sustained Japanese military culture for centuries, burned away in the flames. What emerged from those ashes was a modern understanding that courage without innovation is futile, that tradition without adaptation is suicide, and that the future belongs to those who can change. The Americans learned this lesson too, though in a different way. They learned that technological superiority comes with moral costs, that victory can be achieved through methods that corrode the soul, and that the weapons we use to win wars can haunt us long after the battle's end. The flamethrower operators who returned from the Pacific carried these truths in their nightmares, in their silence, in the way they flinched at the sound of a gas stove igniting. Today, more than 80 years after the first M2 flamethrowers went into action, we live in a world shaped by the lessons they taught. Modern militaries invest billions in precision weapons, trying to achieve the effectiveness of the flamethrower without its moral horror. Drone strikes, guided missiles, and smart bombs promise to destroy enemy positions while minimizing collateral damage. But the fundamental equation remains unchanged. When enemies fortify themselves, when they refuse to surrender, fire in some form remains the ultimate answer. The flamethrower's greatest legacy may be its honesty. It did not pretend to be humane. It did not claim to be surgical. It was fire-made weapon, terror-made tactic, and it achieved its purpose with brutal clarity. In doing so, it revealed truths about warfare that more sophisticated weapons now obscure, that war is hell, that victory requires terrible choices, and that the men who fight carry the weight of those choices forever. On a quiet hillside at Quantico, Virginia, the flame tank from Iwo Jima sits in perpetual display. Its armor is scarred, its paint faded. On certain afternoons, elderly veterans visit, men in their 90s now, the last generation who remember. They stand before the tank in silence. Some salute, others simply stare. Lost in memories they have spent a lifetime trying to forget. A curator once asked one of these veterans what he thought when he saw the tank. The old Marine, who had operated a portable M2 on Okinawa, was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I think about the men we saved by using it, and I think about the men we killed with it, and I think about how both of those thoughts will follow me to my grave." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. In the end, the story of the Japanese troops examining the captured flamethrower is a story about all of us, about how we face weapons we cannot counter, beliefs we cannot sustain, and truths we cannot avoid. Lieutenant Yamada, writing in his notebook as the shells fell around him, was documenting more than a weapon's specifications. He was documenting the end of an era, the death of a mythology, and the birth of a modern understanding that would reshape not just Japan, but the entire world. The flamethrower cleared caves in 45 seconds, but its impact echoes through 80 years, from the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima to the limestone ridges of Okinawa, from the frozen mountains of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam. The weapon taught the same lesson again and again, that innovation overcomes tradition, that pragmatism defeats ideology, and that survival, not honor, is the only victory that matters. The veterans are passing, but the truth they learned, purchased in blood and flame, remains. that in the crucible of total war, the future belongs to those who adapt, and that the price of that adaptation, measured in screams and nightmares and souls forever scarred, is one we are still paying today.